Hi, and welcome to my channel. I'm Emma Kenny and this is True Crime with Emma Kenny. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do. If you haven't watched any of my others, please go back. There's quite a long playlist now of crimes that I cover. I'm not going to lie, before I start today's, I'm going to say I'm a bit angry covering this case. It will play out why I feel this way at the moment at the end. But nonetheless, stick with me. It's really current when I'm doing this, so appreciate that the reason that I have these emotions connected with it is because this is a case that I know from a very long time ago, and it's an ending that I didn't really want to ever have to tell. But stay with me. Today's case is about Colin Pitchfork. He was sentenced to life imprisonment after the murder and rape of two girls. Very young girls, they were both 15. There's not a lot that I've been able to find out about Colin's experience growing up. I know that he was born on March the 23rd, which is my birthday. That's where our similarities end. 1961 he was born, lived in New Bowl Vernon. He attended a school in Market Bosworth and Desford. And basically, to all intents and purposes, there isn't a great deal known about him growing up that sticks out, apart from the fact that he was known to be very lechy amongst girls. So from a very young age, he was one of those boys that was leering after you, said inappropriate things, was a little bit gropey, shall we say. But it's not as if I have this huge amount of information about him being an offender or any abuse that he suffered. Just basically, he was one of those kids that didn't stand out massively, but when he did stand out, it was usually because you thought he was a bit of a pervert. Genuinely, that's what people who knew him said. It's not me saying it. What happened when he left school was he got an apprenticeship, and he was pretty skilled at what he went into. He became a young baker, and it was the place that he worked all the way through until he got arrested. And I will give it to him, he was a craftsman. He went through the whole experience of an apprenticeship and then working and training fully in bakery. He actually had his own sideline actually. But what stood out was he was a good timekeeper, he was very good at his job, and he excelled at the craftsmanship, which he will need later on in this story. One of the things that his boss said when he was interviewed by the police, because obviously he'd known him a long time, and colleagues, was that the problem that he did have with Colin Pitchfork was that no woman was safe as far as his eyes were concerned. You know, he was always looking around at work. These days, in 2021, this would not be acceptable. We've had the hashtag #MeToo movement. We're a lot more aware about sexual discrimination, sexual harassment in the workplace. And basically, if somebody acted the way that Colin acted around his peers and colleagues, there is no way he would have kept his job. But I grew up in a time where it was pretty normal for completely inappropriate behaviour to take place towards women. So this is contextual in spite of the fact of being inappropriate. He did get married to his social worker wife Carol in 1981, but before, just a couple of years before, in 1979, he was actually caught exposing himself. And it was taken really seriously, as it should be, because when somebody is an exhibitionist that way sexually, often there is a gradient of where it can lead. So getting in early is really paramount. I would be incredibly surprised right now if somebody was caught for a similar crime and they were sent straight away for a referral to hospital. I may be wrong, but certainly with the lack of resources I see in the criminal justice system, I would doubt that that's the kind of program that's offered right now. But back then, in 1979, when he first offended, he was referred. He was referred to a psychiatric hospital at Carlton Hayes, and he was given therapy in 1981, which is the same year that he gets married. So let's just take a look at what Colin Pitchfork may have been dealing with at this point. It's known as exhibitionistic disorder, and basically it's a condition where the person who's suffering from it has the urge of exposing themselves to a non-consenting individual. Some people will just have this as a fantasy, so they may be aware that there is a moral code, which means that they're not allowed to obviously go and expose themselves to a random stranger, but for others it moves from fantasy into reality. The reality is that they want it to be somebody who isn't expecting it. They don't want it to be a consenting party. It's considered a paraphilic disorder, which means it's on the sexual spectrum, but it's on the spectrum where we consider it to be, shall we say, a little bit problematic. certainly problematic where exposing yourself to strangers is concerned. But paraphilia can have a whole host of things that wouldn't be considered illegal, but nonetheless we might think was a little bit strange. So this refers to the persistent and intense atypical sexual arousal patterns that are accompanied by clinically significant distress or impairment. So there are quite a lot of subtypes of exhibitionistic disorder, and that all depends on the age of the non-consenting person, because obviously if you're showing your genitals to an adult, that is different from showing your genitals to a child. Yes, both completely illegal, but one is considered more child molestation, whereas the other one would obviously be indecent exposure. So they break them down into these kind of categories. Now, one of the things that a lot of offenders say is that they don't feel that doing that action is something that's really problematic. They don't believe that exposing themselves to vulnerable people who are just walking around doing their own business is going to cause them any trauma. They tend to just think that it's a completely acceptable circumstance, it gets them off sexually, and at the end of the day, they're not actually harming anybody physically. That's a complete justification for their behaviour, but that's why, unless they get caught, it tends to escalate. Colin Pitchfork was excessive in this type of behaviour. He was a repeated exhibitionist to non-consenting people, and he was an individual who grew in his danger. We don't know how many people absolutely go around showing their private parts to other people, but they think around 2 to 4% of the male population are affected. It is, unsurprisingly, sorry to say this guys, less common in females, although it is known to happen. I have had it happen to me twice in my life. I had it happen to me when I was 11 years old, and I had it happen to me when I was 23 years old. So as an individual, I have been flashed on 2 occasions. Both of those occasions, I felt pity for the individual doing it, but on reflection, if it happened to me now, I would have gone straight to the police. Like I said, times have changed. And I bet a lot of you listening to me, if you were brought up in the 80s, you had an experience of this kind of offending yourself. When you make a diagnosis of this, it has to be that the individual has been dealing with this particular behaviour for about 6 months, that they have feelings and lots of arousing fantasies around this particular type of behaviour, and as I said, that they really, really enjoy the idea that it has to be someone who unwittingly walks into their path. They don't want somebody who would also enjoy it. They like the idea of having that power and control, so to speak. One of the ways that they look at diagnosing this to the different categories is whether they like doing it to young children, pubescent children, or of course adults. Or maybe all, because there are some offenders who fall into all those categories. Now, there are lots of reasons that people believe that individuals develop this kind of bizarre disorder: antisocial personality disorder, alcohol abuse, paedophilia, child molestation interests. Also, if they've been sexually humiliated or emotionally abused during their childhood, maybe they've been introduced to sexual behaviours from a very early age, and often there will also be an association with what we know as hypersexuality, where they have a very high level sex drive and where everything that they do tends to go back to sexual behaviour. Like I said, Colin Pitchfork at work was known to be someone who was really lechy and leery, so he was constantly thinking about sex without a doubt. Now, in 1983, he has his first son, and that is the first year that he murders. It's the same year he kills his first victim, or at least the first victim that we find out he ever killed. Whether he killed other people before, I don't know, but certainly the first victim we are aware of. It's interesting that it was the same year that he had his first son, because that makes me think what was going on in his marriage. So often we see this in relationships. When a new baby enters that relationship, understandably, the sex drive of the mother drops, deflects attention from her partner because she's protecting the child. This can cause stress in the relationship. It can also cause issues within a sexual relationship. If you are a hypersexualized individual, if you are an individual with a very high sex drive, if you are someone who has a particular predilection for intense sex often, and then suddenly your partner firstly is looking elsewhere because they're protecting the child and they're giving their attention to the child, and secondly, you're not getting what you think you deserve sexually, And add to that, we have a level of stress because now we have a baby to take care of. These are all things that can make an offender more likely to offend. In fact, when we look at serial killers, one of the things that we look at pattern-wise is any stresses that occurred around the killings that took place. And when it comes to Colin Pitchfork, when you look at the dates of his first and second murder, they both coincide with births of his 2 children. So again, it draws me to believe that part of the provocation for the murders was he didn't feel that he was getting his needs met. And in his head, that would have been acceptable for him to therefore go out and carry out heinous crimes. So on the 21st of November 1993 in Narborough, Leicester, it's around 8 p.m. So Linda Mann is 15, she's been babysitting, she's just doing what she's done so many times before. She's walking home. She lives in such a safe area. I have to get this across to you guys. The crime rate in this particular area was just non-existent. And actually not just in that area, you're talking about in quite a few mile radius. This is one of those places where you leave your back doors open, where your neighbours walk in your house and you don't think you need to protect yourself with a hammer. It's one of those places. So Linda Mann's psychology right now, when a guy pulls up by the side of her, is not to think, oh my God, this person may be here to rape and murder me. Obviously, when he says he's lost and she points out that he's going in the wrong direction, she's probably aware that she doesn't feel that comfortable, but she's not fully on guard. And I need to add to this, he was babysitting his son. So his baby was in the car. And the reason that we know that is because when the police first questioned this man, his excuse is that it's a Monday evening when the crime takes place and that's his babysitting night because his wife goes to the gym. And he gets that validated and verified by his wife, meaning that when he was driving that car, his baby son would have been in the back of it. I think we can all assume at this point what kind of a father he was. So Linda Mann is at this point abducted, raped, and she's murdered by strangulation, and then her body's just dumped. So this has gone from a man who was an indecent exposure to somebody who is now a really dangerous murderer. I mean, it's the kind of worst type of murder, isn't it? It's random, it's of a young girl, it involves rape and strangulation. As I said, this is a tiny community. When people were interviewed about how they felt about this crime, they referred to it as a community disaster because everybody felt like the world that they'd once known had just been completely shattered. Everyone had felt safe there. And it was just one of those places that people thought that they could live their lives freely without fear. And the Black Pan Alley, which is where she was actually taken, he'd followed her. He'd actually made a conscious effort to follow her, and he knew that she was on her own. So when he pulled up that car and went down the alley to ask her those questions, she probably did have a fear that it was unusual behavior, but arguably she could have looked over and seen that there was a baby in the car. And like we know in most cases, if there is some kind of alternative scenario going through your head at a moment in time, such as, oh, it is a dad who's just lost, you're not going to be on your guard as you ideally should have been. And so she just disappears. Her parents stay up all night. This is completely out of character. But like a lot of parents of 15-year-old girls, you kind of think to yourself, and let me tell you, back when I was a kid, I stayed out all the time. I look back now at myself as a teenager, and I understand why my mother would say to me, Emma, I wish on you a child exactly the same as you. And I used to be like, well, great, because I'll know how to treat her better then, won't I? You know, like you did in your dramatic 1980s bad perm kind of style. My God, if my children stayed out all night without telling me, I would have the helicopters out within half an hour after they were meant to be home. I know times have changed. It wasn't like that when I was growing up. It was quite common that without mobile technology, without everybody having a house phone, I know a lot of the younger viewers cannot even imagine that. Yes, a lot of us didn't even have a phone in our home. And the ones that we did have, they were attached to a wall. and you couldn't leave the house with them. And some of them had locks on because you couldn't use them unless your parents said you could. And there was no privacy. To you guys, that probably makes me 7,643. But honestly, to most of us listening, it's like it was just a week ago, technologically, a week ago. But it wasn't unusual. You know, people we used payphones. We used payphones, those big red phone boxes. That was what we used to go and call our mates on. Times have changed. But understandably, her parents weren't absolutely terrified. This was a completely safe area. She was 15 years old. She had a babysitting job. She'd probably gone and stayed with a friend. But obviously the next morning, her parents got a knock on the door. So her parents were actually informed by the police at that point that their daughter Linda's body had been found. Completely catastrophic and completely out of the blue. Neither her parent believed that she died. They just believed that she was going to come home after staying out. Now, from the get-go, the police and people who lived in that area felt that it was somebody who knew the area because of where it happened. It felt like if you knew that particular alley and you knew how to pull over to get somebody's attention from there, it would be strange if you didn't know the area. So people basically began to live in fear. They really started to be afraid. There were interviews of teenagers on the streets saying how everything's changed because this place that they've always considered their community and their safety and their haven is now somewhere where a potential killer is living. Chief Superintendent David Baker, who is amazing all the way through this particular investigation, felt like it was really important to get experts in from the beginning. And he calls in Paul Britton, who's a local criminal psychologist. He, just like the police, felt, yeah, this is someone who lives close to the offence. And I've watched him interviewed and he said, I believe that this particular killer is living in a stable relationship, probably with children, but he has a sexual fantasy cycle where he's constantly wanting to escape from his real life and he's dreaming up these sexual fantasies, these sexual visions, but that this fantasy had split and become reality. And actually, when you look at classic psychopaths, as opposed to them being on street corners about to drag you in off the street, that's not what criminal psychologists, forensic psychologists believe. They're often charming, educated, middle class, in relationships with children. They're seen as good guys. So this kind of profile fits what a lot of psychopathic killers fit. Now, we know that another thing to add at this point is that Pitchfork, aside from fitting the description I've just given, already had a conviction for indecent exposure. So we know that he has a sexual predilection that we would all find unacceptable. But because this has happened in a completely different place years before, the police weren't actually searching the area at the time. What the police didn't know was around the time the killing took place, Pitchfork was thinking of moving to the area that Linda Mann came from. So he did have reason to be in that village. He did have reason to be around that space when the murder took place. But of course, the police would not have been aware of this. Colin Pitchfork was also quite well known in the villages around the area where Linda Mann was murdered. He worked at the local bakery, but he had a little sideline going because he made extra cash selling cakes for people on the side. I mean, on reflection, imagine after I've told this story thinking, I'm really glad that I got Colin Pitchfork to make our wedding cake or my child's 8th birthday cake. Honestly, it would be horrifying. Imagine that you'd ever ingested anything that came from the hands of this human. So only when the police actually start doing face-to-face inquiries do they even come across Colin Pitchfork at all. If he hadn't have moved to the area, I don't necessarily know whether they would have found him at all. I think if Colin Pitchfork had left this area full stop, he would never potentially have been caught. Or he would have been caught the next time he tried killing someone or the next time he actually successfully did. But they do these door-to-door inquiries, and the police officer who goes to his house in 1984, it's January, basically arrives in Littlethorpe at Haybarn Close, which is the home of Colin Pitchfork. His wife let them in, obviously. They have absolutely nothing to hide. And he takes quite a while coming downstairs, and the police say that now on reflection, they think he was trying to compose himself. Obviously, nobody likes the idea of the police coming to their house. It's either bad news or maybe you're in trouble. But he would have known what he'd done. So I guess at this point, he's probably trying to make sure that he looks like he's cool, calm and collected. So they ask him, where were you on the night of the murder? And he kind of suggests, well, I have quite a few problems thinking about that because that's a month ago and I don't really know what I did last week, let alone last month, and I can completely empathise with that. I'd be the same. So there's nothing unusual about that response. But then he asks what date it was on. And when it's a Monday, he turns to his wife and he says to her, oh, that's your gym night. So no, I would have been babysitting. And instantly, that means that he's got a corroborated witness to say that he couldn't have been out of the house. And the police accept that. And one of the things the officers say is, at no point during that conversation did his hackles get risen. Just as far as he was concerned, this was a completely normal guy. It made complete sense. He wasn't afraid, he didn't seem nervous, and he answered questions completely calmly, and he had a valid reason why it couldn't have been him. Now, really frustratingly, because they've done all this questioning, remember technology isn't where it was nowadays, the leads do start to go cold. And even though people in the local area still completely remember Linda, the leads go so dead that a lot of people outside of the area just start kind of forgetting the crime. And then 3 years later, Dawn Ashworth goes missing from Enderby. Remember, this is, as I said before, the same year that Colin Pitchfork becomes a father for the second time. I am just making these assumptions and connections, but I think that's either a trigger of stress or a trigger of denial sexually. And I think that it's built up and, as the criminal psychologist said, has created that cycle of offending. He's building up in that desire and need to act out again. Dawn Ashworth is 15 years old. She'd been to see some friends. She was walking home through a country lane. And as she's walking down that country lane, she walks into a man who indecently exposes himself to her. That is Pitchfork. She panics, understandably, and she starts to run. I can only imagine how she would be feeling in those moments. That is your horror movie moment, isn't it? You walk into this adult, he's exposing himself to you, you're a kid, and all you think about doing is escaping. And so she runs, but he catches up with her, he grabs her, he rapes her, and then he discloses loads of things about his life, bizarrely. Personal information, what he does for a living, tells her about his family. And then, of course, he's told her far too much. Now she knows everything about him. Now, I don't know whether he makes a conscious decision to tell her that so that he can then justify killing her, or whether, as I said, he's got to a position where he is stressed and not getting what he feels he deserves from his relationship. So therefore he's confiding in her because he's not feeling he's getting the attention and affection he wants, because obviously it's all about him and his egocentricity. But nonetheless, the information that he's given her will obviously lead to him being identified. So then he strangles her, and again, he dumps her body in the undergrowth. Two absolutely horrifying murders. And what's really sad is when you listen to her father talk about his daughter's death, he said, I constantly warned her not to walk down those areas because I felt like it was unsafe. And her parents were so brave at the press conference. It's very dated if you go and watch it, but you can see how restrained they are and how desperate they are all in the same moment, but times are very different then. But they're just kind of begging for you, if you know anything, to come forward. And without a doubt, at this point, the police think we have got a double killer. The MO of this crime, it is too similar to Linda's death. Whilst they're doing the searches, a local boy, and I say boy, he's only 17, comes forward. He's been hanging around the path where Dawn was attacked and murdered. And also his motorcycle has been seen near £10 Lane. So he's been seen wandering around the area. He's also asking questions, and also he's telling police that they're looking in the wrong area. Now, I have to say, when I've looked back at Richard Buckland, I think we have an issue with learning disabilities. I think he's an individual who, yes, he's riding a bike, and yes, he can communicate, but his intelligence level is of a low IQ. And therefore, he draws attention to himself more because he's not acting in a way that people would expect you to act if there was a murder investigation going on. Because the bike has been seen, because he's been asking these questions, because he's been in a situation where his behaviour has been considered strange, he's brought in because the police think he's possibly guilty. The police think at this point they've got him. I just wonder, when they were reporting that, how Colin Pitchfork was feeling. You know, there weren't a lot of channels when I was growing up. So I imagine that Pitchfork would have been watching TV, he would have been following the case, and suddenly this 17-year-old young man has been picked up and potentially is going to be charged with murder. And in fact, that's what happens. Richard Buckland is charged with murder. Apparently, after admitting he had indeed killed Dawn. Now, he was 17 at the time. Immediately, that makes me question. It makes me question because that would mean that he was 14 when he carried out the first attack. And if he was 14, he was a year younger than the girl that he killed. I think the idea of him strangling her and raping her is less possible. Of course, boys do that at that age, but it just concerns me a little bit that the police imagine that he's responsible for a double murder at this point. But okay, he's admitted it. They are desperate as a police force to make him take guilt for Linda Mann, because the MO of the crime is so similar. They know whoever killed Linda also killed Dawn, but he won't. He will not accept that he killed Linda. He refuses to. He denies his involvement, and this completely throws the police. They have exactly the same kind of identical murder, and they bloody know whoever killed Dawn killed Linda, and they want to get him. They absolutely want to get him. They've got him admitting it. They've got a body. They've got him asking questions weirdly at the scene. And they've got a confession, essentially. They need to get Linda's murder brought to justice too. So, completely out of the blue, for the first time ever, the police in charge of this case, who've been reading about this particular professor who's looking at DNA research, decide to bring him in. And this is something completely unique. This changed the way of policing forever. They bring in a man called Professor Sir Alex Jeffreys. Back then, he was just Prof. Alex, but because of this work, he became Sir Alex Jeffreys to look at testing the DNA that was found. Now, because there'd been a 3-year interval regarding the initial evidence of Linda's murder and Dawn's murder, Sir Alex said, you know what, we might not be able to find anything for you, because obviously he'd never done this before. Yes, he was looking at DNA. Yes, he was looking at DNA code, which is obviously the important part, but he'd never actually tested it under these circumstances. And until this case, police didn't even have any idea what DNA evidence could prove, because this crime wasn't just about to change the way that criminal cases are tried. It was to change legal history. It was to change the future, where crime as we know it and investigation as we know it is concerned. It was groundbreaking. So for those of you who wonder what DNA testing is, well, obviously you all know that we have a fingerprint. We all have a unique fingerprint, which means that if you get involved in a crime, make sure you take some handy cloths to wipe them off, because only you will have it and they'll be able to find you with it. But DNA and forensic science has grown a great deal. So DNA profiling was first proposed by Alex Jeffreys, Sir Alex Jeffreys now, in 1984, when he basically found that individuals could be differentiated on the basis of readily detectable differences in their DNA. So that's how DNA profiling was first used in this case, because they realised that through certain things such as semen and blood and so on and so forth, you could connect the code of a human being. So in the 1983 and 1986 rapes and murders of Linda Mann and Dawn Ashworth, in this case, when the DNA came back, it did say that the police were absolutely right. The same person was responsible for the deaths of Dawn and Linda. The only problem was, it wasn't Richard Buckland. Nope. He was completely exonerated through DNA analysis in 1987. Now, the police do say that they're surprised that Richard ever took the rap. You know, why would you do that? Why would you agree to sign a confession? I mean, why? And I'm going to say, well, probably in the 80s, policing wasn't kind of what it was these days. And if you want to get someone, you're going to get someone. And come on, we all know that stuff happened, right? I would imagine you've got a 17-year-old kid who's scared to death. He's getting a bit of rough housing, shall we say. I'm not saying it definitely happened, but a lot of young people under a certain amount of stress will do things like sign a confession just to get away from being shouted at. Fortunately, he was exonerated for the absolute opposite reason than the police believed. They thought they'd fitted him up, but they hadn't. And it's great, because even though this is really frustrating for the police, this is also when they start to get really deep into this DNA potential. And I've got to give it to the person in charge of this case. They were willing to put a hell of a lot of resources into this. In fact, because of this case, in 1995, the UK National DNA Database was established to maximise the investigative use of DNA profiles and to identify repeat offenders. On a global scale, most countries now use forensic DNA analysis in one form or another. That's an incredible leap. It's something that has saved other people from being murdered. It's the way that we've had cold cases brought back to life. It's why if you're sat at home watching this and you're a murderer and you've got away with it, your day will come, because that's how powerful DNA is. If I do have any murderers watching me, that would be really interesting. Let me know. So obviously what DNA looks at is the kind of DNA it is, what body fluid it's come from, who it belongs to, how it got there. And when they're going through this and looking at it on crime cases, they have to make sure there's been no contamination, because then it can be reported in a fair and balanced way. And then if they have all of that, you can give that DNA profile and it can be put forward to dispute that anybody other than you was present at that crime, or that the probability of you being the criminal is like 99.999, that a jury would consider it as acceptable. So, as I've said, every single one of us, we all carry a personal code. So now we know that Richard Buckland is innocent. As opposed to nailing the guy, the police found that they never had the guy in the first place. But now, they do have the DNA of the killer. They know it's the same man. It shows that both girls were raped by the same man, killed in the same way. It's sad that Richard Buckland was in prison for 4 months, and it's sad that Leeds went colder because of that. But now we have this DNA and it's changed everything. In what I can only describe as one of the grandest gestures that the police forces could ever have done at the time, they decide, right, we're going to find him. We're going to do blood tests on every single male in the area that they believe the perpetrator could live. That was a grand task. Yes, they were voluntary, but if you think about it, when something is voluntary, counting in is just about as strong as counting out, right? If you go and have your blood taken, you're saying, I'm innocent. And as each person goes and has that voluntary blood test, less and less become the people who don't. Meaning that there is a smaller pool that the police are automatically going to be looking at. So it's really effective. Now, the fly in this ointment could have been, of course, that the person lived outside of the area that they were doing those blood tests on. But nonetheless, credit to the police force, this is a massive task, but something that was very worth doing as far as they were concerned, because they were just waiting for the third death. They knew it was coming. They knew that if they didn't catch this man, there was going to be a cycle again, and he would return to harm someone else. 6,000 men between the ages of 18 to 34 were asked to take part. Again, they've gone for that age framework because the criminal profiler believed that that's what you'd be looking for. So it could have been that he'd been 39, but nonetheless, it was a risk at that point that were worth taking. Many men turned up. There was a huge community presence, and they went in, were obviously found to be completely innocent, and off they went. Now, it did take a while, but Colin Pitchfork eventually was asked to go, and he just told his wife he was not going to. No, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it because I have in the past been caught for indecent exposure, they'll fit me up. I'm not putting myself through that. His wife was suspicious, obviously, but arguably when you live with somebody and you trust them, you've got kids with them, and they've had that difficulty in the past, you could say to yourself, well, maybe it's not a bad experience with the police, but nonetheless, I would have been driving my husband to said place and getting him pushed in there until I got the results. Because personally for me, if somebody doesn't want to go and have a blood test and it's about kids' murders, I'm going to be instantly worried. But she let it go. Like I said, we are on a time frame here. This is a cyclical issue. When his stress builds, he is going to strike. And let's think about this. He's going to be stressed right now, isn't he? All these blood tests taking place, the pool of possibility of offender growing smaller and smaller. He's going to be needing an outlet. And I very much think that we would have had our third murder had it not been for the nous of his next victim. So Liz was hitchhiking her way home. He pulled over, she got in the car, and as she got in the car, she actually said the words to him, "You're not a rapist or anything, are you?" She said, "I got quite a macabre sense of humour," and she just wanted to make herself feel at ease. She said he kind of said something to make her feel comfortable, and then he drove her. And she started to ask questions because she said that he said he knew where he was going. He was going to a certain place locally, and she said that she didn't feel that he was taking the right direction. And when she directs him to where she needs to go, he drives straight past it. And at that point, she realizes that she's in serious trouble. And so she fights. She starts screaming and shouting and hitting. And in the end, she just takes the wheel and she makes him crash the car. She literally makes him crash the car. Now, the minute that she does that, think about it. I always say, the thing about human beings are, the reason that serial killers, for example, continue killing is because the fantasy is always better in their head than the reality. Human beings are unpredictable. Colin Pitchfork has a desire for predictability in his fantasy. His fantasy is that he is in control, that he keeps that control, and that he keeps that control until he has his way with the young girl and then he kills her. That's his MO. She's broken it. She's taken control. She literally screams at him, she removes herself from the car and she runs. She kept that to herself for absolute years. She didn't even tell her parents. She felt absolutely embarrassed. She felt to blame. So many victims of this kind of crime believe that because they willingly got into a car, that somehow they deserve the consequences. Hopefully nowadays we're more awake to the fact that it's not acceptable for anybody to put their hands on you, no matter whether you've gone somewhere with them, no matter whether you've gone back to their place afterwards willingly, no matter whether you've got into that car or otherwise. Your body is your body and no one has the right to touch it. But she kept that to herself. It's a shame because if she'd gone to the police, obviously she would also have been able to have given them some information that could have led to his capture. This blood testing goes on for a long time. So after 7 months, they've tested thousands and thousands of men, but no one's been apprehended. He works in a place where everyone's being tested. That bakery is at the hub of employment. So many people locally that he works with and hangs out with, they're going through this process. And he's actually asked by his work colleagues whether he's had it. And he ends up getting into quite a serious altercation with one of his colleagues because they're saying, listen, you should go. And he's refusing it. Again, I'm going to be honest with you. If that happened at my work, I'd be like on the phone to the police going, one of my colleagues doesn't want to go and have that blood test done. Because instantly I'm like, why would you not? Unless you've got some kind of horrific needle phobia. And then get them to put magic cream on your arm and they'll numb it and you won't even know. You know, it's kind of like really gets me when people miss those signs because that is really disturbing. He really knows at this point that the net's closing in. He recognizes that this is a matter of time because everyone locally to him is having the test. So he has to think of a plan. And I'll give it to him, he's a cunning bugger. So he talks to a colleague and he says, you know, I've actually had this blood test done for a friend of mine who's been in trouble with the police. and I pretended I was him. And now I have to go, and I think that the police are going to realise that I've broken the law by giving my blood, even though I should have given his blood. Well, his colleague's like, no, that would be highly illegal. Why would I do that for you? But then he kind of bullies this other colleague, Ian Kelly. And I mean, bullies for weeks. He's constantly telling him that he needs to go and do it for him because he's done it for another mate and it's only fair that he does it for him. And this guy really doesn't want to do it. But in the end, he just gives in. He doesn't get paid. It's just constant wearing down that he's constantly being asked by Pitchfork to go and do it for him. He's actually been made to feel really, really guilty. It takes 6 weeks. And 6 weeks after the initial request, he just says, okay, I'll do it. He knew it was wrong, but for whatever reason, he feels sorry for him. Now, aside from the fact that Colin Pitchfork would have asked me to go and do that, if I'd been Ian Kelly, I would have been really concerned when he wanted me to go and get some passport photographs taken. I'd be like, this feels a little bit more elaborate than just giving blood. But nonetheless, he goes with him, and Ian Kelly said, look, the day that I went and had those passport photographs taken, I had this really awful flu. I felt horrible. I just wanted to get it over with. So he goes off. He has his passport ID taken, hands over the photographs to Colin Pitchfork, and Colin Pitchfork takes them. And remember, this guy is a master baker. And back at this point in time, passports were not the most challenging to, shall we say, fake. So he gets his passport, he steams open the plastic that covers the picture, and he inserts the picture of Ian Kelly over his own and then irons it back. And he does a really good job. And remember, the police aren't expecting this kind of elaborate cover-up. All they're expecting is guys going in with that ID to have a blood test done voluntarily. The fact that it was voluntarily means that the police wouldn't imagine that some guy has got somebody else to go in and pretend that it's him. So he even dropped him off there, by the way. Colin Pitchfork literally took Ian Kelly there with the fake ID to make sure that he went in and had it done. That is a pretty elaborate way to evade capture. Actually, it's an ultimate way, isn't it? Because if you actually consider that situation, on file now, as far as the police are concerned, Colin Pitchfork's been interviewed once, was found to have an alibi, and now we have his DNA, and he's innocent. So for Colin Pitchfork, he really has got away with murder, at least at this point. Now, Ian Kelly was really sick for a whole week after that occurred. And when he went back, one of the things that really bothered him was that Pitchfork had gone around telling everyone that he'd had the blood test. Because as you know, people had started to ask questions, why haven't you had the blood test, and so on and so forth. I mean, he could have told the story, couldn't he? Well, I did it for a friend, and made that excuse. But no, he wants everyone to be aware that he's now relented and gone and had it. And Ian Kelly said it didn't sit right with him. But again, he wasn't thinking, well, this man might potentially be the murderer of 2 teenagers. Now, the police start looking nationwide at this point because they can't help but believe that somewhere in the system there has to be a connection with the person who's murdered these 2 young girls. They're not giving up. They didn't give up in this case. However, even though DNA was really important in bringing Colin Pitchfork to justice, it's usually something else, very often, that brings the police to be aware of certain significant people of interest. On a night out, just one night out, the girls at work are with Ian Kelly and some other friends. They're having a drink. And they're all kind of having a chat. And Colin Pitchfork comes up in conversation, and the women are all saying about how they have no idea why his wife stays married to him. That he's really uncomfortable to be around, he's constantly playing away, he's really inappropriate around women per se, he makes them feel deeply uncomfortable, and that there is something really wrong about his behaviour. They don't like the way that he speaks to them, they don't like the things that he says to them. He's really over-suggested and he's really over-sexualised when he's around them. And whilst this conversation is happening, one of the guys drinking with them says, oh yeah, I'll tell you what's weird about Pitchfork. He only asked me to go and have a blood test for him. And then all of a sudden, Ian Kelly goes, oh, I took the test for him. When Ian Kelly looks back on that moment, he said, everything went quiet, but no one actually challenged him on it and no one said anything about it. But fortunately, even though no one said anything at that moment in time, one of the women couldn't let it go. She may not have challenged Ian Kelly in that moment, but it had stayed with her. Because she worked with Colin Pitchfork. She knew how inappropriate he was with girls. And she said that more and more daily, she became uncomfortable because she knew this piece of information. And so she calls the police. She tells them what she knows. And that's the break. Because the police know that this stands out. This is a guy who has purposefully and willfully corrupted the course of justice by making sure that they have the wrong DNA on file for him. The same day that she makes that call, the same day, within 3 to 4 hours, the police are staking out his home. And they said it was the longest 3 or 4 hours waiting for them. And then he drives in with his wife. They get out of the car, they arrest him, and the officer said instantly, absolutely instantly, they knew he'd done it. And then of course they take the DNA and they've got the guy. Ian Kelly was also arrested. He had a really hard time afterwards. People thought he was in on the crime. He wasn't. He was just unlucky, gullible, vulnerable. But for years afterwards, people would blame him for the murders as well. It's interesting, isn't it, to think that the police say that without that DNA evidence, they would never have been able to convict Colin Pitchfork. But arguably, I think it's more that if they hadn't been drinking in a pub and that woman hadn't had the conscience to call the police and say who it was, they probably would never have got Colin Pitchfork, because arguably the DNA evidence that they had on him was somebody else's DNA evidence. So really, it just tells you, doesn't it? Often it's those tiny details that people don't tell the police that lead to these huge breakthroughs. So it's really thanks to loose lips in a pub rather than thanks to the DNA. But what is brilliant is that that changed the way that DNA was used. Now, during questioning, this is terrifying. This is terrifying because of what I'm going to tell you. This is terrifying because of what I'm going to tell you. During questioning, he admits exposing himself to over 1,000 women. 1,000 women. A compulsion that he says started as a teenager. He then progressed to sexual assault and strangling his victims in order to protect his identity. He pled guilty to 2 rapes and murders in addition to another incident of sexual assault. And the Chief Justice at the time said he was doubtful that he should ever be let out. Yeah. You would imagine that. 1,000 indecent exposures, 2 rapes of children, 2 murders, indecent assault of others. You would hope that he'd never get out. He was given a minimum sentence of 30 years, which bizarrely was appealed, and he had it reduced to 28 years. I don't know who did that appeal, but okay. For some reason, he got 2 years off it. Now, sometimes I think that the woke brigade are just a little bit too woke, that they slide into the territory of utterly stupid. And the example that I'm going to give you now is a sculpture that Pitchfork did in 2009, a sculpture done by a child murderer. It was exhibited at the Royal Festival Hall called Bringing the Music to Life, and the festival hall then bought it for 600 quid. Made by the hands of a child molester, rapist and murderer. Unsurprisingly, the locals said, you better take it down, and it got taken down. But I'm all for rehabilitation, but not in this case. This is not about rehabilitation. How do you rehabilitate somebody who is a serial offender, a serial sexual abuser, a serial killer? How do you do that? Do you display their artwork? This has happened before with other killers. It sends me to a different place. I'm like, no, let them do it in prison. Let them put it on their wall in their cell, but just let's leave it there. I don't need to know that they've suddenly become a good sculptor. It really doesn't bother me. On the 22nd of April 2016, he got his parole board. They heard he was educated. He can transcribe printed music into Braille. He's now reformed. Because that is the evidence, isn't it? I mean, if you can be educated and you can now transcribe particularly Braille, printed music, then you must not be a child killer. That's how it works. That's how the psychological experience works. That's how we know you're reformed, because you can transcribe printed music into Braille. So now you must be safe. It was fortunately refused. But in 2017, he was moved into an open prison. Now that's cushy. It's cushy, an open prison. And it should be, because it's all about rehabilitating you to get back into a normal experience of life. And after a period of time in prison, you're going to need that, right? If you're going to be free. If you're going to be free. And some people definitely deserve to be free. And in 2017, there's actually pictures of him walking around Bristol. So he's getting day leave at that point. Somebody who exposed himself 1,000 times, raped, strangled and murdered 2 children, definitely tried to do the same to others, is walking around the shops on day release. On the 3rd of May 2018, he was refused leave on licence, but he obviously is having some kind of day leave, just not full leave. But on June the 7th, 2021, yes, literally just now, he was released on conditional licence. This is a man who, when asked in court why he raped and murdered those innocent teens, he replied, because they were there. Pitchfork was sentenced to life. And in my opinion, that's because there was no doubt at that point in time that when they sentenced him, they believed he would never get out, because he would have continued to act in that way, to be an offender. And I have to agree fully with the Conservative South MP Alberto Costa, who thinks this man should spend the rest of his life behind bars. Linda's father, Jonathan, Linda, his first victim, he's stricken with Parkinson's disease. He can't grasp the situation right now. But his wife, Karen, said her husband is stuck in hospital because there's no money for care. But Pitchfork, well, he got all the support he ever hoped for. Is that justice? I'm angry that this man will walk our streets. I don't believe that someone who can brutally murder 2 girls, who can manipulate and coerce, who can defy the law in so many different ways, who is a gross offender when it comes down to public displays of indecent exposure. Can you really reform those kind of people? Because according to science, according to DNA, it sounds very much to me like he's got the violence gene. And that doesn't sleep. That just waits in the wings until that person gets another opportunity. And you have to also ask yourself, sometimes an offender, when they get out, they're more concerned about reliving a fantasy because they know the consequences. They've lived them, they've survived them. But the fantasy of going out and harming again may well outweigh the consequence of being locked up. I have no idea why Colin Pitchfork has been allowed to walk our streets. Do you? I hope telling you this tale of terror has evoked something in you as far as sympathy and empathy for the victims' families. I don't know how I'd feel if I knew that the killer of my child, who'd done it in such a brutal way and had done it again and had been convicted of so many other crimes really, was now free to just get on with her life. How is that justice? Can somebody answer me that? And also, if that person, if Colin Pitchfork goes ahead and murders again, it won't be him who's to blame. It really won't be. He'll just be a manipulative psychopath who's managed to work the system in his favour so he's got freedom so he can play out his fantasies again. That'll be not on him, because that's who he is. Because if that is his DNA, if he is a human predator, then he's always going to be that. Meaning that the people on the parole board are responsible for any of his subsequent crimes. It's as simple as that. If I'd been on that parole board, you know what I'd have thought? There's a 1% chance he might do it again. and he'd never see the light of day. Let him stay in a reasonable prison. Don't deny him his human rights in that way. But can you honestly say that a man who brutally murdered 2 children after raping them, after exposing himself over 1,000 times, just because he's been able to learn how to transcribe Braille and has become academic, now isn't going to go murder people? If there's a shred of doubt, he should never have been allowed out. And I guess that only time will tell. And isn't that awful? That time may very well tell. And I imagine that all our sentiments are shared in the fact that if there's a message that we want to send, it's to the families of those murdered girls, because we know the injustice that he is getting to live his life freely when those children were denied theirs. Join me next time. Take care.